where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
Here's something nobody tells you about fairy tales. They're lies. Beautiful, seductive lies that make you believe love conquers all, that princes rescue princesses, and that happily ever after is just one romantic gesture away. But what happens when your prince is made of ice? What happens when your marriage isn't a love story, but a business transaction signed in silence and sealed with cold handshakes instead of warm kisses? What if I told you that the most degrading moment of your life could become the secret catalyst for the most unexpected transformation? That public humiliation could be the trace that leads to genuine connection. It sounds crazy, right? Contradictory even. But that's exactly what happened to Lady Isabel Cavendish when she agreed to marry a man who openly admitted he'd never love her. A duke so emotionally frozen that London society called him the Duke of Ice. She thought she was entering a loveless arrangement to save her bankrupt family. She thought she'd spend her life playing a role, wearing a mask, existing in a marriage that was really just a well-decorated prison. She was wrong about everything. The thing is, we've been taught that marriages of convenience are relics of the past, that nobody in their right mind would accept a relationship without love, passion, or genuine affection. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Millions of people are living in transactional relationships right now. Maybe it's staying together for the kids. Maybe it's financial security. Maybe it's social status or family pressure or just the fear of starting over alone. We judge historical arranged marriages while ignoring that we're often arranging our own lives around everything except genuine emotion. Isabel's story matters because it's a mirror reflecting our own compromises, our own sacrifices, our own moments of choosing security over authenticity. And what makes it absolutely fascinating is this. She discovered something that most people never do, that sometimes the relationships we enter for the wrong reasons can transform into something more real than the ones we enter for love. That the foundations built on honesty, even brutal honesty, can be stronger than those built on romantic illusions. That being chosen for practical reasons doesn't mean you can't eventually be chosen for who you actually are. But let me be clear about something crucial. This isn't one of those stories where the woman's love fixes the broken man. It's not about Isabel being so special that she melts the Duke's frozen heart through sheer persistence and feminine charm. But let me be clear about something crucial. This isn't one of those stories where the woman's love fixes the broken man. It's not about Isabel being so special that she melts the Duke's frozen heart through sheer persistence and feminine charm. That's the fairy tale trap, and we're not doing that here. This is about two damaged people entering an arrangement designed to protect them both from further pain, only to discover that walls built to keep everyone out can also trap you inside with your own fears. It's about the enigma of human connection, how it finds cracks in even the most fortified defenses, how it grows in the most unlikely soil, how it refuses to follow the codes and contracts we try to impose on it. Isabel's journey from purchased bride to genuine partner didn't happen because she was patient or sweet or perfectly behaved. It happened because she refused to disappear, refused to be small, refused to accept humiliation without demanding respect in return. Here's the controversial part that'll make some people uncomfortable. Isabel made the right choice. Yes, she married for money. Yes, she sold herself to save her family. Yes, she accepted a loveless arrangement with a man who treated marriage like a corporate merger. And you know what? That took more courage than waiting for a real love story that might never come. We romanticize choosing love over security, but we rarely acknowledge the privilege required to make that choice. when your family faces ruination, when poverty threatens to destroy everyone you care about, when you have the power to prevent catastrophe through personal sacrifice. Judging that choice from a position of comfort is easy. Making it when you're the one who has to live with the consequences, that's the real test of character. And this is where the story gets interesting, where the mystery deepens. What if the transactional beginning was necessary? What if Arthur choosing her for practical reasons rather than passion was actually the foundation that allowed genuine feeling to develop later? What if the absence of romantic illusions created space for authentic connection? Now, before you think this is going to be a simple romance where everything works out perfectly, let me set the record straight. Isabel's path to becoming Duchess of Thornfield was paved with conspiracy, betrayal, and the kind of psychological warfare that high society perfected over centuries. Women who smiled while destroying her reputation. Whispered campaigns designed to isolate and humiliate her. Public attacks disguised as concern. And the worst moment, standing in a ballroom full of London's elite while someone systematically dismantled her dignity in front of everyone who mattered, exposing every secret shame, every hidden vulnerability, every reason she didn't deserve her soon-to-be title. That moment should have broken her. By every calculation, it should have sent her running back to obscurity and poverty. Instead, it became the catalyst for something nobody expected, least of all the Duke himself. Because here's what makes this story absolutely compelling. The revelation that changed everything wasn't Isabel's. It was Arthur's. The conventional narrative would have Isabel gradually warming Arthur's cold heart through patience and devotion, right? That's how these stories usually go. But what actually happened was far more complex and infinitely more satisfying. When Arthur watched his future wife being publicly humiliated, watched her stand there with her spine straight and her dignity intact despite everything, he had to confront something he'd been denying since the day they met. That choosing someone for practical reasons doesn't mean you can't come to value them for entirely different ones. That a woman brave enough to accept a loveless marriage might actually be stronger than one who demands fairy tale romance. That the walls he'd built to protect himself were also preventing him from living. And in that moment, faced with the conflict between his carefully maintained emotional distance and the growing reality of his feelings, Arthur Wellesley did something the Duke of Ice had never done before. He chose vulnerability over control. He chose public declaration over private safety. He chose Isabel over his own fear. So here's what you're about to discover in this story. How a woman with nothing but courage and determination navigated one of the most treacherous social landscapes in history. How she survived attacks designed to destroy her, faced humiliation that should have broken her, and emerged not just intact, but transformed. How a marriage that began as cold calculation evolved into something neither party anticipated or could control. How the hidden feelings they both tried to deny eventually demanded recognition. And most importantly, how sometimes the relationships that look least promising from the outside, the ones without romance or passion or the right beginning, can become the most genuine, precisely because they're built on truth rather than fantasy. This isn't a story about love at first sight. It's about respect earned through trial, connection forged through adversity, and the slow thawing of ice that everyone assumed was permanent. It's about what happens when two people stop performing the roles society expects and start becoming who they actually are. And if you're sitting there thinking your own relationship feels more like a transaction than a romance, if you've ever chosen security over passion or duty over desire, if you've ever wondered whether settling for less than the fairy tale makes you a coward or a realist, this story is for you. Because Isabel's journey proves something that challenges everything we've been taught about love and marriage. That sometimes the most powerful connections aren't the ones that start with fireworks and passionate declarations. Sometimes they're the ones that begin in silence and grow in unexpected directions. Sometimes being chosen for practical reasons is just the beginning of being chosen for who you really are. Sometimes the arranged marriage is just the prologue to the real story. And sometimes, just sometimes, the Duke of Ice melts not because he has to, but because he wants to. Because he's finally found someone worth the risk of feeling again. You know, there's something profoundly unsettling about watching your entire future get negotiated like it's some sort of business merger. Lady Isabel Cavendish sat in that dimly lit study, surrounded by the scent of aged leather and expensive cigars, while men in powdered wigs discussed her fate as if she weren't even there. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional scratch of quill on parchment. This wasn't just any arrangement. It was the kind of trace that'd haunt generations, a decision wrapped in secrecy that'd ripple through time. Her father's desperate eyes met hers for just a second, and in that glance, she understood everything. The family fortune had disappeared into thin air, gambled away on foolish investments, and even more foolish pride. Now, she was the solution, the sacrificial lamb dressed in silk and pearls. Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Thornfield, didn't look at her with desire or even mild interest. He studied her the way you'd examine a horse before purchase, assessing, calculating, determining if the investment was sound. There wasn't an ounce of warmth in those steel-gray eyes, just cold pragmatism that'd make a banker proud. "She'll do," he finally said, as if commenting on a piece of furniture. Can you imagine? Being reduced to "she'll do" on what should have been one of the most important moments of your life? It's like going to a job interview where you're not even pretending there's passion involved, just mutual need wrapped in legal documents. The enigma of his emotionless demeanor intrigued Isabel, despite herself. What turns a man into ice? What makes someone treat marriage like a corporate acquisition instead of a sacred bond? The terms were laid out with brutal efficiency. Isabel would become Duchess of Thornfield, gaining status, protection, and financial security for her entire bloodline. In return, she'd manage his estates, host impeccable social events, produce an heir, and, most importantly, ask no questions about his private life. It was a code of conduct written in invisible ink, understood but never explicitly stated. "Think of it as a partnership," her father whispered, trying to soften the blow. "But partnerships usually involve some level of mutual respect, don't they?" This felt more like servitude dressed up in expensive fabrics. She'd heard whispers, of course. Everyone had. The conflict between Arthur and his first wife, Caroline, had been the scandal of the decade. Some said she'd been unfaithful. Others claimed it was all a conspiracy designed to remove her from the picture. Either way, Caroline was dead now, and Isabel was about to step into her ghost's shoes. When she picked up the quill to sign, her hand trembled, not from fear of the man sitting across from her, but from what this silence meant for her soul. Every girl grows up dreaming about love, doesn't she? About finding that one person who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses you above everyone else. Isabel had those dreams too. She'd imagined passionate declarations under moonlight, stolen kisses in gardens, love letters written with genuine emotion. Instead, she got contract negotiations and financial projections. Her signature on that document wasn't just ink on paper, it was the death of her romantic illusions. 22 years old, and she was already burying the girl who believed in fairy tales. The hidden pain of that realization was almost unbearable, but she kept her face composed, aristocratic, perfectly controlled. The thing about arranged marriages among nobility is that everyone pretends they're something else. They dress it up with fancy ceremonies, elaborate receptions, and formal announcements in society papers. But strip away the pageantry, and you've got what Isabel had, a transaction. Arthur needed a respectable wife to maintain his position and silence the gossips who'd been whispering about his bachelor ways for too long. Her family needed money to avoid complete social disappearance and potential bankruptcy. Simple arithmetic, really. It's not unlike modern corporate marriages, those mergers where CEOs marry for connections rather than connection. The only difference? At least modern people can divorce without losing everything. In Isabel's world, this decision was permanent, binding, absolute. Once she became the Duchess, there was no escape clause, no backing out, no "let's try separation first." Arthur's handshake after signing was firm, cool, and lasted exactly 3 seconds. She counted. It wasn't the touch of a future husband. It was the acknowledgement of a business partner. "We'll marry in 6 weeks," he stated, not asked. "That gives you time to prepare, and my staff time to ready Thornfield Manor for its new mistress." New mistress. The phrase hung in the air like a secret nobody wanted to acknowledge, because that's what she was replacing, wasn't it? The old mistress, the dead wife, the woman whose mysterious end had turned Arthur into this fortress of a man. Isabel wanted to ask 1,000 questions. What really happened to Caroline? Why did you really choose me? Do you feel anything at all? Or is your heart as frozen as your expression suggests? But the code of their arrangement was already clear. Curiosity was forbidden territory. Walking out of that study, Isabel felt like she was leaving more than just a room. She was leaving behind the version of herself who had agency, who had choice, who had the mystery of an unknown future filled with possibilities. Now everything was mapped out, predetermined, calculated down to the last detail. Her younger sister Margaret grabbed her arm in the hallway, eyes wide with questions. "Are you truly going through with this?" she whispered. Isabel straightened her spine and replied with more confidence than she felt. "Sometimes courage isn't about following your heart. It's about doing what must be done, even when every part of you screams otherwise." It's a harsh lesson, but one that builds character in ways comfortable choices never could. Think about the difficult decisions you've made in your own life, the ones where you chose responsibility over desire, duty over dreams. Yet, here's what nobody tells you about making seemingly impossible choices. They reveal who you really are. Isabel could have refused, could have condemned her family to poverty and disgrace, could have clung to her romantic fantasies. But she didn't. She chose the harder path, the one that required sacrifice rather than selfishness. That decision, made in a smoke-filled study with a man who looked at her like an asset rather than a person, would set in motion a revelation that nobody, not Arthur, not society, not even Isabel herself, saw coming. Because sometimes the most transactional beginnings lead to the most transformative endings. And as she lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, Isabel made herself a silent promise. If she was going to be the Duchess of Thornfield, she'd do it on her own terms. She'd play their game, follow their rules, maintain their codes, but she'd never, ever lose herself completely in the process. The morning after signing her life away, Isabel received a formal invitation. If you can call a summons from your future husband an invitation. Arthur wanted to see her at Thornfield Manor to discuss the practicalities of their arrangement. The carriage ride there felt like traveling to another world, one where she didn't quite belong yet. And when those iron gates opened to reveal the estate, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a house. It was a declaration of power, old money, and centuries of aristocratic dominance. Every stone seemed to whisper secrets of generations past. Every window reflected a history she was about to become part of, whether she liked it or not. The gardens were impossibly perfect, like something out of a painting where even nature knew its place. Isabel felt small, insignificant, like an actress about to step onto a stage where everyone else already knew their lines. Walking through those massive oak doors was like entering a museum dedicated to wealth and tradition. The entrance hall alone was bigger than her family's entire drawing room. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to judge this newcomer who dared enter their domain. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the echo of her footsteps on marble floors that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. A butler, because of course there was a butler, led her through corridors that seemed to go on forever, each more lavish than the last. Crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, furniture that screamed, "Don't even think about sitting on me unless you're worthy." It's like walking into Buckingham Palace and being told, "Yeah, this is your home now. Act natural." How does anyone act natural surrounded by this much intimidating opulence? Every object seemed to carry the weight of expectation and the trace of perfection that came before her. Arthur was waiting in his private study, and somehow he looked even more formidable in his own territory. He gestured to a chair across from his massive mahogany desk, not beside him, not casual, but across, like a business meeting. And that's exactly what it was. "I believe in clarity." What it was? "I believe in clarity," he began without preamble. "No, how are you? Or did you sleep well?" Just straight to the point. Our arrangement works because we both understand what it is and what it isn't. You'll be Duchess of Thornfield in title and function. You'll manage the household staff, oversee social obligations, represent this family with dignity and grace. He paused, studying her reaction with those calculating eyes. "In return, your family's debts are cleared, your social position secured, your future guaranteed." It was the most unromantic speech anyone could give to their future wife. Yet there was something almost respectful about his honesty. No false promises, no pretend affection, just the truth laid bare like codes in a legal contract. But here's where Isabel did something that surprised both of them. Instead of meekly nodding and accepting her role as the submissive wife, she leaned forward and asked, "And what are your obligations to me, Your Grace?" The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur's eyebrow raised slightly, the most emotion she'd seen from him yet. You could practically hear his thoughts. Did she just challenge me? Because in that world, wives didn't question their husbands, especially not before the wedding even happened. But Isabel wasn't playing by the old playbook anymore. If he could be direct, so could she. "If I'm to fulfill my duties, it seems only fair that yours are equally defined. Or is this a one-sided arrangement where I give everything and you give money?" The enigma of his expression shifted. Was that respect flickering behind those cold eyes? She'd essentially called his bluff. And men like Arthur weren't used to being challenged, especially not by women half his age. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, and Isabel wondered if she'd pushed too far, too fast. But then Arthur did something unexpected. He almost smiled. Almost. "You have more spine than I anticipated," he said. And it wasn't quite a compliment, but wasn't an insult either. He stood, walked to the window overlooking his vast estates, hands clasped behind his back in that aristocratic pose of contemplation. Very well. My obligations, fidelity during our marriage, financial security for you and any children we have, protection of your reputation and person, and honesty about the nature of our relationship. He turned back to face her. I won't pretend to love you, Miss Cavendish, but I will never publicly humiliate you or treat you as less than the Duchess you'll become. Is that acceptable? It was the most transactional definition of marriage. Vows ever spoken, yet something about his directness was almost refreshing. At least she knew exactly where she stood, on solid ground of mutual understanding, rather than the shifting sands of false romance. Then came the revelation that changed everything. As Arthur outlined the remaining expectations, separate bedrooms until an heir was needed, limited public displays of affection, her autonomy in managing household affairs, his voice caught ever so slightly on one phrase, former wife. That's when Isabel gathered her courage and asked what everyone whispered about but nobody dared say out loud. What really happened to Caroline? The room went from cold to arctic. Arthur's jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he might throw her out for such audacity. But instead, he poured himself a drink. Expensive scotch that probably aged longer than Isabel had been alive, and said something that made everything click into place. Caroline taught me that love makes you vulnerable, and vulnerability in our world is exploited. She had an affair with my closest friend, made a fool of me in front of all of London, and when confronted, chose to end her life rather than face the consequences. The hidden pain in his voice was unmistakable despite his controlled delivery. Suddenly, the ice made sense. The walls he'd built weren't to keep people out. They were to keep the pain in, contained, manageable. Arthur wasn't born cold. He was made that way by betrayal so profound it shattered whatever capacity for trust he once had. So, you see, Miss Cavendish, he continued, his voice returning to that measured, emotionless tone, I don't choose you despite your circumstances. I choose you because of them. You need this arrangement as much as I do, which means you won't have romantic illusions that lead to dangerous expectations. You won't mistake duty for love, obligation for passion. You are, quite simply, the safest choice I could make. And there it was, the truth that stung worse than any insult. She wasn't chosen for being special, extraordinary, or even particularly desirable. She was chosen for being safe, predictable, unlikely to cause the kind of conflict that destroyed his first marriage. It's like being hired for a job not because you're the best candidate, but because you're the one least likely to sue the company later. Practical? Absolutely. Flattering? Not even close. Yet, as Isabel sat there, processing this brutal honesty, she understood something crucial. They were both prisoners of their circumstances, both making the best of impossible situations, both hiding their vulnerabilities behind different masks. His mask was ice. Hers was about to become an impenetrable facade of perfect aristocratic composure. And maybe, just maybe, two broken people could build something functional, if not exactly whole, from their shared understanding of what it meant to survive, rather than simply live. 3 weeks later, the moment of truth arrived, Isabel's official debut as the future Duchess of Thornfield. She'd spent hours getting ready, and I mean hours. This wasn't just putting on a nice dress and doing your hair. This was warfare preparation disguised as beauty rituals. Her lady's maid had laced her corset so tight she could barely breathe, because apparently suffering for beauty was a requirement of high society. The dress itself was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that shimmered like sapphires under candlelight. custom-made by London's finest modiste at Arthur's insistence. Pearls that once belonged to his mother, not Caroline, his actual mother, adorned her. Neck and wrists, each one probably worth more than her family's annual income used to be. Her hair was swept up in an elaborate style that took 2 maids and 90 minutes to perfect. Looking in the mirror, Isabel barely recognized herself. She looked like a duchess, sure, but she felt like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's life. The secret fear gnawing at her stomach was simple. What if they all saw through the costume? The thing about entering high society is that it's exactly like being the new kid at school, except everyone's wearing diamonds and the bullies have titles. The carriage ride to the Pemberton estate felt like traveling to an execution, her hands clammy despite the cool evening air. Arthur sat across from her, impeccably dressed in black tailcoat and white cravat, looking every inch the powerful duke he was. "Remember," he said quietly, "they'll test you tonight. Every word, every gesture, every response will be analyzed and dissected. Show weakness, and they'll devour you. No pressure, right? It's like being told, just be yourself, right before a job interview that'll determine your entire future." The trace of anxiety must have shown on her face, because he added almost gently, "You look perfect. Walk in like you own the place, and half the battle is won." Coming from the man who barely showed emotion, that almost compliment felt like a full declaration of confidence. Isabel straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and prepared to enter the battlefield armed with nothing but silk, pearls, and sheer determination. Walking into that ballroom was like stepping into a different universe where everything glittered and everyone watched. The Pemberton mansion was even more extravagant than Thornfield, all gold leaf and crystal, with a ballroom that could fit a small village inside it. A string orchestra played from a balcony, champagne flowed like water, and everywhere Isabel looked, she saw the cream of British aristocracy in their finest attire. And every single one of them turned to stare when she was announced. Lady Isabel Cavendish, betrothed to His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by whispered conversations behind fans and gloved hands. She could practically hear their thoughts. That's her? That's the nobody who caught Thornfield? What's so special about her? It's that nightmare where you show up to school naked, except you're fully dressed, and somehow that makes it worse because there's no excuse for their judgment. Every eye assessed, measured, and found her wanting. She was the gazelle who'd just walked into a pride of lions, and they were deciding whether she was worth the hunt. But then Arthur appeared at the bottom of the grand staircase, and something shifted. He extended his hand to her with that same cool formality, but there was something different in his eyes. Not quite warmth, but perhaps possession? Pride? As if to say, yes, this is my choice, and I dare any of you to question it. Isabel descended those stairs like she was walking a tightrope. One wrong step, and she'd tumble into social obscurity. But she made it, placed her hand in his, and felt his fingers close around hers with surprising firmness. For the first time since this whole arrangement began, she didn't feel completely alone. They moved through the crowd together, and Arthur's presence beside her was like having a shield. People smiled, whether genuine or fake was anyone's guess, and offered congratulations that sounded more like condolences. "How wonderful," they'd say, meaning how unexpected. "What a surprise," they'd coo, meaning what were you thinking? The codes of aristocratic communication was all about what wasn't said, the meanings hidden behind polite phrases and practiced smiles. That's when Isabel met her first real adversary. Beatrice Pemberton materialized from the crowd like a beautiful viper in emerald green silk, all golden curls and practiced charm that didn't quite reach her cold blue eyes. She was everything Isabel wasn't. Born into wealth, raised in luxury, confident in her place at the top of the social hierarchy. "Lady Isabel," she purred, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "How absolutely delightful to finally meet you. The engagement was so wonderfully sudden. Arthur is typically so selective." The emphasis on selective carried the unspoken question. What made you worthy? Isabel recognized the tactic immediately. It's the same way mean girls operate everywhere, from boarding schools to ballrooms. Compliment with one hand while sliding the knife in with the other. Make it sound like concern while really highlighting everything you lack. The enigma was how to respond without seeming defensive, but also without rolling over and showing her belly like a submissive dog. Isabel smiled. Not warmly, but with the polite coolness she'd been practicing in the mirror. "Sometimes the best decisions are made quickly, Lady Pemberton. When something is right, there's no need to deliberate endlessly." It was a diplomatic non-answer, but Beatrice wasn't finished. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that others nearby could absolutely hear. "Of course, we were all so shocked. After Caroline, we thought Arthur might remain unmarried indefinitely, or perhaps choose someone from a family with more established connections. There it was, the direct hit. Your family is broke. You're beneath him. You don't belong here." The hidden message was crystal clear. "I am better than you. I should be standing where you are, and everyone here agrees with me." Isabel felt her cheeks burn, not from shame, but from anger she had to suppress. Because showing emotion meant losing, and she refused to give Beatrice that satisfaction. "Established connections are valuable," Isabel replied evenly. "But fresh perspectives can be equally so. Stagnant water grows algae, after all." It wasn't her best comeback, but it was something. And she saw a flicker of surprise cross Beatrice's perfect face. The evening continued in that vein, verbal sparring disguised as polite conversation, smiles that were really bared teeth, compliments that were actually insults. Isabel met Duchess after Countess after Lady, each one sizing her up with varying degrees of subtlety. Some were genuinely kind, welcoming her with real warmth that felt like finding an oasis in a desert of hostility. Others were like Beatrice, sharp, calculating, ready to exploit any weakness they could find. The mystery of navigating these social dynamics was exhausting, like playing chess when you only half know the rules and everyone else is a grandmaster. She smiled until her face hurt, made small talk about weather and fashion, and pretended that every whispered comment she caught wasn't about her questionable pedigree. Did you hear her father gambled away their fortune? Thornfield must be desperate for an heir to choose her. How long do you think before he finds a mistress? The trace of their cruel speculation followed her like smoke, impossible to escape, poisoning every interaction with doubt. By the time the dancing began, Isabel felt like she'd survived a battle, bruised, exhausted, but still standing. She'd made it through the introductions, weathered Beatrice's attacks, and maintained her composure even when everything inside her screamed to run. Arthur found her near the refreshment table, looking slightly worn despite her best efforts to hide it. "You're doing well," he said quietly, and coming from him, that was practically effusive praise. Then he did something unexpected. He led her toward the dance floor as a waltz began. "They need to see us together," he explained. "See that you're mine and under my protection." It wasn't romantic, just strategic. But as they moved into position and his hand settled on her waist, Isabel realized something. She wasn't just surviving this world anymore. She was beginning to understand how to navigate it. The forbidden question still lingered, though. Would understanding it ever mean truly belonging to it? Or would she always be the outsider who learned to wear the right mask? As the music swelled and they began to dance, she caught Beatrice's venomous glare from across the room and thought, "Let the real games begin." The moment Arthur's hand touched her waist, something shifted in the air between them. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, just a subtle change, like when clouds part and sunlight breaks through. His other hand took hers with that same controlled precision he applied to everything, but there was a gentleness there that surprised her. They began moving to the waltz, and Isabel realized she'd never actually danced with him before. Their entire relationship had been contracts, conversations, and cold formalities. But dancing? Dancing is different. It's a conversation without words, a code written in movement and proximity. Every step, every turn, every moment when their bodies moved in sync said something that their mouths never had. She could feel the strength in his grip, the confidence in how he led, and beneath that, something that felt almost like protectiveness. It was as if he was silently telling everyone in that ballroom, "She's mine, and you will respect her." The secret thrill of that realization sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. Arthur leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the music. "I should have warned you about Beatrice. She can be difficult." It was the closest thing to an apology Isabel had heard from him, and it caught her off guard. The Duke of Thornfield didn't apologize, didn't explain himself, didn't acknowledge mistakes. Yet here he was, essentially admitting he should have protected her better. "I handled it," Isabel replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. His eyes, those steel-gray eyes that usually looked through people rather than at them, actually focused on her face, studying her with something that might have been approval. "Yes, you did. Better than I expected, actually." Coming from anyone else, that would have sounded insulting. From Arthur, it was practically glowing praise. They continued dancing, and Isabel felt herself relaxing into the rhythm, into his lead, into the strange intimacy of being held by someone who was technically still a stranger, but also somehow becoming familiar. The enigma of their relationship was that it made no sense. No feelings, yet growing connection. No romance, yet undeniable chemistry. Then Isabel did something bold, something she'd been dying to ask since that first meeting. "Lady Pemberton mentioned Caroline earlier," she said carefully, watching his reaction. She felt his body tense, saw his jaw clench slightly. For a moment, she thought he might simply refuse to answer, might shut down completely the way he did whenever emotions threatened to surface. But instead, he surprised her again. What exactly did Beatrice say? His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it. Not anger at Isabel, but at the situation, at people who couldn't leave the past buried where it belonged. She implied there were expectations between you two? That perhaps Caroline wasn't the only one who disappointed you? The words hung between them. Dangerous territory that could explode at any moment. Isabel held her breath, wondering if she'd just destroyed whatever fragile understanding they'd built. The silence stretched for 3 full beats of music before he responded. "Beatrice has an active imagination fueled by wounded pride," Arthur finally said, his voice carrying that aristocratic disdain he reserved for particularly foolish things. There was never anything between us except her fantasies and my complete disinterest. She reminds me too much of Caroline. Beautiful, charming, and completely self-serving. She would marry for a title and spend her days making me miserable while spending my fortune. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than she'd ever heard it. Caroline taught me what happens when you marry for love. You give someone power over you, and they use it as a weapon. She had an affair with my closest friend, humiliated me publicly, and when confronted, chose death over facing the consequences of her actions. So yes, Beatrice's expectations were always one-sided, and she knows it. The revelation of his pain, spoken so plainly while they danced among hundreds of people, felt like a gift. A glimpse behind the fortress walls he'd built around himself. Isabel understood then that his coldness wasn't cruelty. It was survival. The music swelled, and Arthur guided her through a turn that brought them closer together, their faces mere inches apart. "That's why I chose you, Isabel," he said, using her first name for the first time since they'd met. The intimacy of it sent a shiver down her spine. "Not because you're desperate, though desperation played its part, but because you understand that this arrangement is exactly what it appears to be. Mutual benefit, without the poison of false expectations. You won't betray me because our agreement doesn't pretend to be something it's not. You're safe, predictable, honest about what you want." He studied her face as they moved together. "And you won't break my heart because I'm not foolish enough to give it to you." It should have stung, being called safe and predictable, being told he'd never love her. But somehow, it didn't. Because Isabel recognized the compliment hidden in his brutal honesty. He trusted her precisely because their foundation was truth rather than pretty lies. The hidden meaning was that he respected her enough to be vulnerable in his own guarded way. But here's the thing about people dismissing their own feelings. They're usually lying to themselves first. As they continued dancing, Isabel noticed things. The way Arthur's thumb absently stroked the back of her hand, how his eyes kept returning to her face, instead of scanning the room as they usually did, the almost smile that played at the corner of his mouth when she stumbled slightly, and he steadied her. These weren't the actions of a man feeling nothing. These were the unconscious gestures of someone beginning to care, despite his best efforts not to. It reminded Isabel of that saying, "The heart wants what it wants, regardless of what the head demands." Arthur could build all the walls he wanted, establish all the codes and rules and boundaries. But emotions don't follow contracts, do they? They seep through cracks, grow in unexpected places, bloom even in the coldest soil. The mystery was whether he'd recognize what was happening before his own defenses destroyed any chance at genuine connection. "There's something else you should know," Arthur said, as the waltz neared its end, his voice dropping even lower. "Caroline didn't just betray me with anyone. It was my brother, my younger brother, Edmund. They carried on for months right under my roof, laughing at me behind my back. And when I discovered them together, she didn't apologize or beg forgiveness. She told me she'd never loved me, that marrying me was the biggest mistake of her life, that Edmund made her feel alive in ways I never could." The raw pain in his admission was like watching someone tear open an old wound. 3 days later, she threw herself from the East Tower. Edmund fled to the continent and hasn't returned since. So you see, Lady Isabel, when I say I won't love you, I'm not being cruel. I'm being realistic. Love destroyed everything I'd built, cost me my brother, my wife, my reputation, and nearly my sanity. I won't make that mistake again. The trace of that tragedy still haunted every corner of his life, every decision he made, every wall he reinforced. As the final notes of the waltz played, Arthur held her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. But I will honor you, protect you, and ensure you never regret accepting my proposal. That may not be love, but it's something stronger. Commitment born from choice, rather than fleeting emotion, and nearly my sanity. I won't make that mistake again. The trace of that tragedy still haunted every corner of his life, every decision he made, every wall he reinforced. As the final notes of the waltz played, Arthur held her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. But I will honor you, protect you, and ensure you never regret accepting my proposal. That may not be love, but it's something stronger. Commitment born from choice, rather than fleeting emotion. Then he did something that sent ripples through the entire ballroom. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. Not the perfunctory social gesture, but a real kiss that lingered, that spoke of possession, and perhaps something deeper he refused to name. The room erupted in whispers, because the Duke of Thornfield never showed public affection, never displayed favoritism, never let anyone see behind his controlled facade. Yet here he was, making a statement for all of London's elite to witness. Isabel was his, under his protection, and anyone who challenged that would face his wrath. As they walked off the dance floor together, Isabel's heart raced not from exertion, but from understanding. She'd just witnessed the man behind the title, the wounded soul beneath the ice, and the carefully hidden truth that Arthur, Wellesley, was fighting feelings he swore he'd never allow again. The forbidden question was whether she wanted him to lose that battle, and what it would mean for both of them if he did. Isabel thought surviving the first dance was her victory, that she'd proven herself worthy, and the worst was behind her. Oh, how naive that was. Because Beatrice Pemberton wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She was the type to regroup, strategize, and come back with reinforcements. Over the next hour, Isabel started noticing things. The way conversations would pause when she approached, then resume in hushed tones once she passed. How certain ladies would exchange meaningful glances when she spoke, as if sharing a private joke at her expense. The secret smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as paranoia or insecurity. But then, the pattern became undeniable. She was being isolated, systematically cut off from potential allies, marked as an outsider who didn't deserve her soon-to-be position. Think about it like this. You know how in offices, there's always that group that controls the social dynamics? They decide who's in and who's out, through nothing more than silent agreements and coordinated exclusion. That's exactly what was happening here, except with tiaras and champagne instead of coffee and cubicles. The real conspiracy became clear when Lady Victoria Ashford, one of Beatrice's closest friends, approached with a smile so fake it could have been painted on. "Lady Isabel, what a unique dress," she said. And every woman within earshot knew that unique was code for inappropriate or trying too hard. Another ally, Lady Charlotte Winters, chimed in immediately. "Yes, midnight blue is such a bold choice for a debut. Most girls choose white or pastels to signify innocence and new beginnings. But I suppose when one is older, bolder colors are necessary." The trace of insult was unmistakable. She'd just called Isabel old, desperate, and unfashionable in one breath while maintaining plausible deniability. If Isabel protested, she'd look oversensitive. If she stayed silent, she'd appear weak. It was a perfectly executed social trap, and they knew it. These women had been training for this kind of warfare since they were in finishing school, and Isabel was an amateur, stepping into a professional arena. The code of their attack was clear: death by 1,000 tiny cuts, each one small enough to seem insignificant, but collectively devastating. Then came the accidental exclusions. "Oh, we're organizing a garden party next week for all the young duchesses and future duchesses," Lady Victoria mentioned loudly enough for others to hear. "It'll be so intimate and lovely, just our closest circle." The unspoken message? Isabel wasn't in that circle and never would be. Another woman mentioned an upcoming charity event for ladies of established families only, emphasizing the word established, while looking directly at Isabel. It's like being in high school and watching everyone get invited to the party except you, then having them discuss it right in front of your face to make sure you know you're excluded. The psychological warfare was masterful, really. They weren't being overtly cruel. Nothing Isabel could point to and call out directly. They were just leaving her out, making her feel like the intruder she feared she was. The enigma of high society is that its weapons are invisible, but no less deadly. A sword wound heals. Social ostracism can last generations. But the real attack came from Lady Margaret Pemberton, Beatrice's aunt and one of the most powerful matriarchs in London society. She was the type of woman who could destroy reputations with a raised eyebrow, and had been doing so for 40 years. She approached Isabel during dinner service when everyone was seated and captive to witness whatever would unfold. "Lady Isabel," she began, with that grandmotherly smile that fooled no one, "you must be so thrilled about your upcoming marriage. Arthur is quite the catch. Wealthy, titled, influential." She paused for dramatic effect, her voice carrying across nearby tables. Of course, we were all shocked by how quickly it happened. Usually engagements in our circles take months of courtship, but yours was settled in what? A few weeks? One almost wonders what prompted such efficiency. The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone knew what she was implying, that Isabel must be pregnant, that Arthur was being forced into marriage, that something scandalous had happened to necessitate such speed. The hidden accusation hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything it touched. Isabel felt her face burn with humiliation, but Lady Margaret wasn't finished. "And your family's situation? So unfortunate. Financial troubles can happen to anyone, of course, but gambling debts are particularly distressing. Your poor father must be so relieved that you've secured such an advantageous match." There it was, spoken out loud for everyone to hear. Not whispered, not implied, but stated as fact. Isabel's father was a gambling addict who'd destroyed their fortune, and she was selling herself to save them. Every word was technically true, which made it impossible to deny without looking like a liar. And the way Lady Margaret said it, with that concerned, sympathetic tone, made it sound like she was being kind rather than cruel. "I do hope Arthur understands what he's taking on. Supporting an entire family's debts is quite the burden, even for someone of his means." The woman actually patted Isabel's hand like she was offering comfort, instead of delivering a fatal blow to her reputation. It was a master class in social destruction disguised as compassion, and everyone watching knew exactly what was happening. The mystery was whether Isabel would crumble or fight back. The conspiracy became fully visible when Beatrice joined her aunt, along with Victoria and Charlotte, forming a semicircle around Isabel like sharks circling wounded prey. They'd coordinated this, planned it, probably rehearsed their roles. Beatrice took the next strike. "Of course, Arthur does have a history of making surprising choices. His first wife was a love match, and we all know how tragically that ended. Perhaps this time he's chosen practicality over passion. A wife who understands her place and won't have unrealistic expectations. The implication was clear. You're not good enough for love, just good enough for function. You're the boring, safe option he settled for after the real love of his life destroyed him. You're a replacement, a placeholder, a warm body to produce heirs and manage servants. The conflict between wanting to defend herself and knowing that any defense would sound desperate tore at Isabel's composure. How do you fight against truth, weaponized as insult? How do you maintain dignity when they're systematically stripping it away? Victoria added her contribution to the group assault. I suppose there's something admirable about accepting one's circumstances. Not everyone can marry for love. Some of us must be practical. Charlotte nodded enthusiastically. Yes, and really, what does love matter when there are debts to pay and positions to secure? Romance is such a luxury for those who can afford it. They were all smiling, all using pleasant tones, all pretending this was friendly conversation rather than coordinated character assassination. Other guests had stopped their own conversations to watch the spectacle, some looking uncomfortable, others clearly enjoying the drama. And Isabel stood there, alone in a crowd of hundreds, feeling smaller by the second. The trace of their cruelty would follow her for years. Every social event, every introduction, every whispered conversation would reference this moment when she was publicly marked as inferior. The forbidden tears threatened to fall, but she refused them, because crying would prove everything they said about her being weak, unworthy, unable to handle the demands of her new position. That's when something inside Isabel shifted. She'd been playing defense this entire night, trying to survive, trying to fit in, trying to prove she belonged. But you know what? Maybe she didn't belong in their world of cruelty disguised as civility. Maybe she didn't want to be part of a society where destroying people was considered entertainment. She thought about her sister Margaret's words before she left. Don't let them make you small. She thought about Arthur's assessment. Show weakness, and they'll devour you. She thought about every difficult moment in her life that she'd survived. Poverty, shame, desperation, and realized these women with their jewels and titles had never faced real hardship. They'd never had to choose between pride and survival. Never had to sacrifice dreams for duty. Never had to stand in a room full of enemies and pretend to be strong when everything inside was screaming. But she had. And that made her stronger than they'd ever be. The revelation hit her like lightning. She wasn't less than them. She was more. Because she'd earned her place through courage, while they'd simply inherited theirs through birth. The code of their world said bloodline mattered most. But Isabel was about to show them that character mattered more. Just when Isabel thought she'd found her inner strength, Beatrice decided to go nuclear. Because here's the thing about people who are used to winning. They don't handle resistance well. Isabel's subtle pushback, her refusal to completely crumble, had clearly irritated Beatrice enough to abandon all pretense of civility. The evening was winding down, guests were gathering for the final toasts before departure, and Arthur was across the ballroom deep in conversation with several other dukes about Parliament matters. Isabel stood near the refreshment table, desperately needing a moment to breathe, to collect herself, to prepare for whatever fresh hell awaited. She should have known that moment of vulnerability would be when Beatrice struck hardest. Predators always attack when prey is isolated, don't they? The secret timing of what came next was no accident. It was calculated, rehearsed, designed for maximum impact with minimum escape routes. Isabel was alone, exposed, and about to face the worst moment of her entire life. Beatrice positioned herself strategically in the center of the room where most guests had gathered, her voice projecting with the clarity of someone trained in theatrical performance. She raised her crystal champagne flute high, the chandelier light making it sparkle like a weapon disguised as celebration. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "if I might have your attention for just a moment." The room fell silent with that peculiar hush that happens when people sense drama approaching. All eyes turned toward Beatrice, then followed her gaze to where Isabel stood, frozen like a deer sensing the hunter's arrow. "I believe we should offer a special toast tonight to our newest member of the peerage." The enigma of her smile was that it looked genuine to anyone who didn't know better, but Isabel saw the venom behind it, the satisfaction of someone about to deliver a killing blow. This wasn't going to be a toast. It was going to be an execution dressed up as honor. "To Lady Isabel Cavendish," Beatrice continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "soon to be the Duchess of Thornfield." Polite murmurs rippled through the crowd. This seemed innocent enough so far. But Isabel's stomach churned because she knew Beatrice wasn't done. May she bring to Thornfield the same remarkable dedication that she brought to saving her family from complete financial ruin. The words hit like a slap across the face. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, suffocating. Every single person in that room understood exactly what Beatrice had just done. She'd announced to all of London's high society that Isabel was marrying for money, that her family was bankrupt, that she was essentially selling herself to the highest bidder. It wasn't an implication anymore, wasn't a whispered rumor. It was a public declaration of Isabel's desperation and Arthur's apparently poor judgment in choosing such an unsuitable bride. The trace of those words would follow Isabel forever, defining her in society's eyes not as a woman of worth, but as a fortune hunter who'd successfully trapped a duke. Time seemed to slow down as Isabel stood there, every eye in the ballroom boring into her like physical pressure. Her face burned with humiliation so intense it felt like her skin was on fire. Her vision blurred as tears threatened, not gentle, dignified tears, but the kind that come from soul-deep shame and rage mixed together in a toxic cocktail. Her hands trembled so badly she had to clasp them together to hide it. But that just made her look guilty, didn't it? Like someone caught in a lie, rather than someone being publicly destroyed for telling the truth. Some guests looked away, uncomfortable with the cruelty they were witnessing, but too cowardly to intervene. Others barely concealed their delight at the scandal, already mentally composing the letters they'd write tomorrow to spread this juicy gossip to anyone who'd missed tonight's spectacle. And Beatrice? She stood there with that satisfied smile of someone who'd just won the war, not just the battle. Her message was clear. This is what happens when you don't know your place. This is what happens when you try to climb above your station. The hidden pleasure in her eyes made Isabel's stomach turn. The worst part, the absolute worst part, was that Beatrice was right. Every word she'd said was factually accurate, which made it impossible to defend against without looking like a liar or a fool. Yes, Isabel's family was financially ruined. Yes, her father had gambled away their fortune. Yes, she was marrying Arthur to save them from poverty and disgrace. Yes, their engagement had been a business transaction rather than a love story. Standing there in her borrowed jewels and expensive dress, surrounded by people who'd been born into the privilege she was desperately trying to marry into, Isabel felt like a fraud exposed, like the girl playing dress-up in her mother's clothes who'd been caught and humiliated in front of everyone. The conflict between wanting to defend herself and knowing that any defense would just dig the hole deeper paralyzed her completely. What could she say? Actually, I'm marrying him for love? Everyone would laugh. My family's situation isn't that bad. They all knew the truth. How dare you? That would just make her look defensive and prove she was ashamed of her circumstances. The crowd's reaction was almost worse than Beatrice's attack. It was like watching a jury deliver a guilty verdict through their body language alone. Isabel could see it happening in real time, the way people subtly stepped back from her, creating physical distance, as if poverty and desperation were contagious. The way the more established ladies raised their fans to their faces, not to cool themselves, but to hide their whispered comments about her. The way men looked at her with that particular mixture of pity and contempt, reserved for women who've been publicly shamed. She'd gone from being Arthur's interesting new fiancée to being London's latest scandal in the space of 30 seconds. One toast. That's all it took to destroy months of careful positioning and weeks of effort to fit in. The mystery of how quickly reputation could be demolished wasn't really a mystery at all. Society was like a house of cards, and Beatrice had just pulled out the foundational card while everyone watched it collapse. The forbidden tears Isabel had been fighting so hard to contain burned behind her eyes, threatening to spill over and complete her humiliation. Some faces in the crowd showed genuine discomfort at what they'd witnessed. These were the few decent people who recognized cruelty even when it was dressed up in silk and delivered with a smile. But they didn't speak up, didn't defend Isabel, didn't call Beatrice out for her viciousness. Because that's how these social systems work, isn't it? Good people stay silent to protect their own positions, and bullies rule through everyone else's cowardice. Isabel saw Lady Catherine Devonshire, who'd been kind to her earlier, look away with an expression of pained sympathy, but no action. She saw Lord Hampton shift uncomfortably, but make no move to intervene. Even Lady Pemberton, who'd started this whole campaign of destruction, stood back looking satisfied with her niece's handiwork. They were all complicit through their silence, all guilty of allowing this public execution to proceed without objection. And Isabel? She was the criminal being hanged while the crowd gathered to watch, some throwing stones, others just observing, but none cutting her down. The code of their world was clear. Might makes right. Cruelty is entertainment, and the weak deserve whatever happens to them. The absolute worst thought that crashed through Isabel's mind in that moment was the most devastating of all. What if Beatrice is right about everything? Not just the facts, those were indisputable, but the implications. What if she really didn't deserve to be Duchess? What if she was fooling herself, thinking she could belong in this world? What if every cruel thing they'd said and thought about her was justified? Standing there with her carefully arranged hair and her borrowed pearls, she felt like the ultimate imposter. A poor girl playing at being rich. A nobody pretending to be somebody. A desperate woman who'd sold herself and was now being publicly reminded of the price tag. The revelation that cut deepest was this. The humiliation hurt so much because part of her believed she deserved it. Part of her had always known she didn't belong, that she was reaching above her station, that she'd eventually be found out and punished for her audacity. And now that moment had come. The secret shame she'd been carrying since the day she signed that contract. The shame of needing rescue, of accepting a loveless marriage, of being bought like property, had just been dragged into the light for everyone to see and judge. And judge they did. Isabel's legs felt weak. Her breath came in short gasps that she tried desperately to control, and her vision narrowed to a tunnel focused only on the exit. Every instinct screamed at her to run. Out of the ballroom, out of the mansion, out of this life she'd tried to buy her way into. She could leave right now, break the engagement, return to poverty, but at least return to dignity. Wasn't obscurity better than this kind of notoriety? Wasn't being poor, but anonymous, better than being wealthy, but despised? The trace of tonight would never fade. She'd be that girl forever. The cautionary tale mothers would tell their daughters about desperation and its consequences. And as she stood there, frozen between the desire to flee and the stubborn refusal to give Beatrice the satisfaction of seeing her break, Isabel made a choice. If she ran now, they'd won completely. If she cried, they'd won completely. If she defended herself, they'd won completely. The only way to survive this moment with any shred of dignity intact was to stand there, spine straight, face composed, and refuse to react. Let them see that their words, while cutting deep, hadn't destroyed her completely. Let them wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was stronger than they'd calculated. Because the truth was, she'd survived worse than public humiliation. She'd survived the private hell of watching her family crumble, and she'd do whatever it took to ensure that never happened again, even if it meant enduring this nightmare with her head held high. Isabel was seconds away from doing it, from walking out of that ballroom with whatever scraps of dignity she could salvage and never looking back. Her feet were already shifting toward the door, her mind calculating the fastest escape route that wouldn't involve pushing through the crowd that had just witnessed her destruction. She'd decided, better to end this engagement now, return to obscurity, and live poor, but at least live without this constant humiliation. Arthur could find another wife, one who actually belonged in his world. Her family would suffer, yes, but surely that was better than enduring this kind of public torture for the rest of her life. The secret plan was forming in her mind. She'd leave tonight, write Arthur a letter explaining her withdrawal, and disappear before the gossip could spread further. It was over. She'd tried and failed. And that was that. But then, something happened that changed absolutely everything. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Arthur Wellesley crossed the ballroom floor. Not rushed, not panicked, but with that predatory grace of a lion who'd just noticed someone threatening his pride. Every eye that had been on Isabel now swiveled to watch the Duke of Thornfield, and the silence somehow became even more profound, if that was possible. You could have heard a pin drop in that massive room. Isabel's first thought was that he was coming to end things himself, to publicly distance himself from her now that her unsuitability had been so thoroughly exposed. Why would he defend her when Beatrice had just done him a favor by revealing what a terrible choice he'd made? But the expression on Arthur's face wasn't embarrassment or anger at her. It was something far more dangerous. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone from steel gray to storm dark, and every line of his body radiated controlled fury. Not at Isabel. At them. At everyone who'd just stood by and watched his future wife get verbally executed for their entertainment. The trace of emotion on his usually impassive face was startling enough that several people actually stepped back as he passed. When Arthur reached Isabel, he didn't say a word, didn't ask if she was okay, didn't acknowledge the crowd, didn't even glance at Beatrice, who stood frozen with her champagne glass still raised like a monument to her own cruelty. Instead, he did something so unexpected. so utterly out of character for the man known throughout London as the Duke of Ice, that gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. He reached up with both hands, cupped Isabel's face with a gentleness that completely contradicted the fury in his eyes, and kissed her. Not a polite peck on the cheek, not a formal kiss on the hand. A real, honest-to-God, take-your-breath-away kiss right there in front of everyone. His lips claimed hers with a possessiveness that sent electricity shooting through her entire body, one hand sliding into her hair, destroying the elaborate style that had taken hours to create and somehow making it even better, the other wrapping around her waist and pulling her flush against him. The enigma of the moment was that it felt both completely calculated and entirely genuine. A public declaration that also somehow managed to feel intensely private. Time stopped. The world narrowed to just the two of them, his lips on hers, his hands holding her like she was precious rather than convenient, his body shielding her from the judgmental crowd. Isabel's mind went blank of everything except the sensation of being kissed by a man who, until this moment, had barely touched her beyond formal handshakes and one carefully controlled waltz. This wasn't the kiss of a business partner. This was the kiss of a man claiming what was his, defending what he valued, declaring war on anyone who dared challenge his choice. Her knees actually went weak. It's a cliché, but it happened. And if Arthur wasn't holding her so firmly, she might have collapsed right there. The kiss seemed to last both an eternity and no time at all, and when he finally pulled back, Isabel was breathless, flushed, and completely disoriented. But Arthur looked utterly composed except for that dangerous glitter in his eyes that promised retribution for anyone who'd hurt her. The code of his action was unmistakable. She is mine, and you will respect her or answer to me. Still holding Isabel's face in his hands, Arthur turned his head just enough to address Beatrice without actually releasing his grip on his future wife. The protective gesture wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Lady Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying that aristocratic authority that came from generations of men who were obeyed without question. "Your toast was remarkably transparent." The word hung in the air like an accusation. "Yes, my bride comes to me from circumstances that required courage most of us will never need. She accepted an arranged marriage to save her family, an act of selfless sacrifice that in any sensible society would be admired rather than mocked." He paused, letting that sink in while Beatrice's face drained of color. "But your commentary reveals far more about your own character than hers. Jealousy, I've found, makes people extraordinarily cruel." The hidden message was clear. Everyone now knew Beatrice's attack came from wounded pride and unfulfilled desires, not from any actual concern about Isabel's suitability. Arthur had just publicly diagnosed her motivations and found them pathetic. Then Arthur did something that literally made several people gasp out loud. Still holding Isabel against him, he addressed the entire ballroom. "My fiancée doesn't need to prove her dedication to saving anyone. She's already proven her worth in ways that matter far more than bloodline or bank balance." His voice softened just slightly as he finally looked down at Isabel, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart skip several beats. She's brave enough to enter a world designed to reject her, strong enough to stand tall when people try to make her feel small, honest enough to accept hard truths without pretty lies, and dignified enough to maintain composure while being publicly attacked by cowards who hide cruelty behind social niceties. He lifted her hand to his lips, Not the brief, formal gesture from earlier, but a lingering kiss that felt like a promise. "She's not my salvation," he said quietly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. "She is the salvation of me." The revelation in those words hit the room like a thunderclap. The Duke of Thornfield, who never showed emotion, who'd been frozen solid since his first wife's betrayal, had just publicly declared that Isabel meant something to him. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was almost physical. The people who'd been eagerly watching Isabel's humiliation now shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing they'd backed the wrong horse in this race. Beatrice looked like she might be sick, her perfect complexion gone pale and splotchy with mortification. Lady Margaret Pemberton had the grace to look ashamed, perhaps recognizing that her niece had gone too far and dragged their family name into mud by association. Other guests suddenly became very interested in their champagne or the floor, or literally anything except making eye contact with Arthur, who was still radiating that controlled fury that promised consequences for anyone foolish enough to continue the attack. The mystery of how quickly mob mentality can reverse itself isn't really mysterious at all. People follow power, and Arthur had just made it crystal clear where the power stood. Not with the establishment, not with old money, not with Beatrice and her conspirators, with him, and by extension, with Isabel. Arthur finally released Isabel's face, but immediately took her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture far more intimate than anything required by social protocol. "Now," he said, his voice returning to that cool, aristocratic tone that somehow made everything he said sound like an imperial decree, "I believe this evening has run its course. My fiancé and I will be departing." It wasn't a request or an explanation. It was a statement of fact. They were leaving, and the party could continue or end without them because they were no longer concerned with anyone else's opinion. He began guiding Isabel toward the exit, and the crowd parted before them like subjects before royalty. As they passed Beatrice, Arthur paused just long enough to say quietly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I trust we won't receive any more invitations from the Pemberton household. We'd hate to decline publicly and make things awkward." It was the social equivalent of a death sentence. Arthur had just announced that anyone associated with the Pembertons would be persona non grata with the Duke of Thornfield, and given his influence, that meant social exile for Beatrice and her entire faction. As they walked out of that ballroom together, Isabel felt like she was in a dream. Or maybe she'd passed out from shock and this was some kind of elaborate hallucination. But no, Arthur's hand was solid and warm around hers, his body was a steady presence beside her, and she could still feel the phantom sensation of his lips on hers. Behind them, the party erupted into immediate, frantic conversation. Hundreds of people all trying to process what they'd just witnessed and adjust their social calculations accordingly. The Duke of Ice had melted, publicly, spectacularly, for a woman everyone had written off as unsuitable. He'd kissed her like he meant it, defended her like she mattered, claimed her like she was worth claiming. And in doing so, he'd completely rewritten the code of their relationship from cold transaction to something infinitely more complex. The conflict that had defined their arrangement, business versus emotion, practicality versus feeling, had just shifted dramatically in a direction neither of them had anticipated. As Arthur helped her into his carriage and climbed in beside her, sitting much closer than necessary, Isabel finally found her voice. "Why did you do that?" His answer was simple but loaded with meaning. "Because they needed to understand that attacking you means attacking me. And because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words, "because watching them hurt you made me realize something I've been denying since the day we met. The forbidden question hung between them. What exactly had he realized? And what did it mean for their carefully constructed arrangement based on emotional distance? As the carriage pulled away from the Pemberton estate, Isabel understood that tonight had changed everything, that the secret feelings they'd both been ignoring had just been dragged into the light as publicly as her shame had been, and that whatever happened next would be entirely different from what they'd planned. The Duke of Ice had thawed, and there was no going back to Frozen now. So now you know the whole story, how a transaction became transformation, how ice melted into warmth, how public humiliation became the catalyst for private revelation. But here's the real question. What are you going to do with this knowledge? Because Isabel's story isn't just entertainment. It's a mirror reflecting the choices you face every single day. Are you living authentically, or are you performing a role that society expects? Are you building walls to protect yourself that are actually imprisoning you? Are you so afraid of vulnerability that you're choosing loneliness disguised as safety? Think about it honestly. How many times have you rejected opportunities because they didn't fit the fairy tale narrative you've been sold? How many times have you judged others, or yourself, for making practical choices instead of romantic ones? The secret truth is that most of us are living some version of an arranged marriage, whether we admit it or not. We've arranged our lives around fear, around expectations, around everything except genuine connection and authentic feeling. Here's what I want you to understand. Isabel didn't wait for permission to claim her power. She didn't wait for Arthur to validate her worth. She didn't wait for society to accept her before deciding she belonged. She walked into that ballroom knowing she was the outsider, faced humiliation that would have destroyed most people, and still stood tall because she understood something crucial. Your value isn't determined by other people's judgment. Your worth isn't defined by your bank account, or your bloodline, or your ability to meet impossible standards. Isabel was just a girl from a bankrupt family who married for money, and she became the woman who changed the Duke of Ice himself. Not through manipulation, or games, or playing a role, but by being exactly who she was and refusing to apologize for it. So, I'm asking you, where in your life are you apologizing for existing? Where are you making yourself small to make others comfortable? Where are you accepting humiliation because you believe the codes that say you don't deserve better? Let me challenge you with something that might make you uncomfortable. What if the thing you think disqualifies you is actually your greatest strength? Isabel thought her desperation made her weak. It actually made her brave enough to take risks others wouldn't. She thought her lack of pedigree made her inferior. It actually freed her from the constraints that trapped everyone else. She thought accepting a loveless marriage meant giving up on happiness. It actually led her to something more real than most love matches ever achieve. The trace of your struggles, your compromises, your supposedly shameful choices. What if those are exactly what qualify you for the transformation you're seeking? What if your brokenness is the crack that lets the light in? What if the things you're hiding are the things that could set you free if you had the courage to own them? Think about that seriously. What would change in your life if you stopped running from your truth and started building on it instead? And let's talk about Arthur for a second, because his transformation is just as important as Isabel's. Here was a man so damaged by betrayal that he built an entire identity around emotional invulnerability. He turned himself into ice because ice doesn't hurt, doesn't feel, doesn't risk being shattered again. Sound familiar? How many of you have done exactly that? Convinced yourselves that not feeling is the same as not hurting? Arthur's revelation came when he realized that protecting himself from pain also meant protecting himself from everything that makes life worth living. Connection, intimacy, the terrifying, exhilarating experience of caring about someone enough that losing them would destroy you. He had a choice in that ballroom: maintain his walls and watch Isabel suffer alone, or risk everything by publicly claiming her. He chose risk. He chose vulnerability. He chose to feel even though feeling could hurt him again. So here's my question for you. What walls are you maintaining that are protecting you from pain, but also preventing you from truly living? Now, I know some of you are thinking, this is a fictional story about dukes and duchesses in a time period that doesn't exist anymore. What does this have to do with my life? Everything. It has everything to do with your life, because the hidden dynamics of power, shame, judgment, and redemption haven't changed. They've just updated their costumes. You might not face a conspiracia attack at a ballroom, but you absolutely face judgment every day from people who think they know your worth better than you do. You might not be marrying a duke, but you're absolutely making compromises between security and authenticity. You might not have literal servants, but you're absolutely managing personas and performing roles, and hiding your true self behind carefully constructed facades. The silence Isabel broke when she refused to accept humiliation quietly, that's the same silence you need to break when you stop accepting treatment you don't deserve. The choice Arthur made to publicly defend her, that's the same choice you need to make to publicly defend yourself, your worth, your right to take up space in the world. Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. Transformation requires crisis. Isabel didn't become the woman she needed to be through gentle self-improvement. She was forged in the fire of public humiliation and came out stronger because she refused to let it consume her. Arthur didn't thaw gradually over time. He had a moment of clarity that forced him to choose between his protective walls and genuine connection. Real change doesn't happen in comfort. It happens when you're pushed to your absolute limit and have to decide: break or evolve, surrender or fight, stay small or claim your power. And I'm telling you right now, you're at that moment whether you recognize it or not. Something brought you to this story. Something made you read all the way to this conclusion. That something is your own crisis knocking at the door, your own transformation waiting to begin, your own choice between staying frozen in safety or risking the thaw. So, what's it going to be? Are you going to wait for permission, validation, the perfect circumstances? Or are you going to do what Isabel did and walk into your own ballroom with your spine straight and your dignity intact, regardless of who tries to humiliate you? Let me leave you with this final thought. The most revolutionary act you can commit is refusing to be small. Refusing to accept the codes that say you're not good enough, not worthy enough, not deserving of the life you want. Refusing to let your past define your future. Your circumstances determine your destiny. Your critics dictate your worth. Isabel was supposed to be the cautionary tale, the desperate girl who sold herself for a title and lived miserably ever after. Instead, she became the woman who transformed not just her own life, but the life of the most powerful, most damaged man in London. She did that by refusing every single expectation placed on her except one: the expectation she placed on herself to survive, to thrive, to claim the life she'd chosen even when everyone said she didn't deserve it. That's the enigma of true power. It doesn't come from perfect circumstances or flawless execution. It comes from imperfect people making brave choices in impossible situations and refusing to quit when the universe conspires against them. So here's what I want you to do right now. Think about the biggest compromise you've made in your life. The thing you're ashamed of? The choice you defend but secretly question? The situation where you chose security over authenticity or duty over desire? Got it? Good. Now I want you to ask yourself, what if that choice wasn't a failure? What if it was exactly what you needed to do at that moment, and the only mistake is continuing to carry shame about it? What if, like Isabel, you could own your truth so completely that nobody could weaponize it against you anymore? What would your life look like if you stopped apologizing and started building? If you stopped defending and started declaring? If you stopped surviving and started thriving? That's not a rhetorical question. I genuinely want you to imagine it. Picture yourself walking into your own version of that ballroom, facing your own version of Beatrice, standing tall despite the whispers and the judgment and the conspiracy attacks designed to make you small. Now picture yourself refusing to shrink. Picture someone, or better yet, picture yourself, standing up and saying, "Enough." Picture the moment when you stop letting other people write your story and start claiming the pen yourself. That feeling you're experiencing right now? That mix of fear and excitement and what if? That's the beginning of transformation. Don't ignore it. Don't rationalize it away. Don't wait for the perfect moment, because there is no perfect moment. There's just this moment, right now, where you decide whether you're going to stay frozen or risk the thaw. And listen, if you got value from this story, if something here resonated with your own journey, if you recognized yourself in Isabel's courage, or Arthur's walls, or even Beatrice's cruelty, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel and activate those notifications. Not because I need the numbers, but because you need the reminders. You need to keep hearing stories about imperfect people making brave choices. You need to keep confronting the forbidden truths about power, worth, and transformation. You need to keep challenging the narratives that keep you small and scared and stuck. This channel is about digging into the mystery of human nature, the codes we follow without questioning, the secret power we all possess but rarely claim. It's about taking stories from history and revealing what they teach us about right now, about our own lives, our own choices, our own capacity for evolution. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, join this community of people who refuse to accept the limitations others place on them. Because Isabel's story doesn't end here. There are hundreds more stories of people who faced impossible odds, made controversial choices, and transformed themselves through sheer force of will. And every single one of them has lessons that could change your life if you're brave enough to apply them. The question is, are you? Are you ready to stop being the victim in your own story and start being the hero? Are you ready to face your own ballroom, your own humiliation, your own moment of choice? Because I promise you, it's coming whether you're ready or not. And when it does, you'll want to remember what you learned here. You'll want to channel Isabel's courage, Arthur's decisive action, and the revelation that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept the role others have written for you. So subscribe, activate those notifications, and let's continue this journey together. Your transformation is waiting. The only question is whether you're brave enough to claim it.